Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I was really surprised, when I got the invitation to speak in Edmonton and in Toronto, because I didn't think that anybody would know me here, and we're still figuring out, how come, that they invited me. But anyway, it's a great honor to me. Please forgive my English, as I'm really a student of Polish literature, not of English literature, nor American literature. So I've also written the text in English, and I'm sure there'll be many mistakes. So you please forgive them, because I didn't really have the time for anybody to go over the text. I'll also talk a little about the photographs you're going to see. I decided, or I was asked, do you want to show all the pictures? So I said, yes, why not? I am a collector of old photography. In most of my literary works, I use photography. Also, I write about photography. I'm a very bad photographer myself, tragic. But I do collect, and I have a very rich collection, I'm proud of it, Galician photography, or photographs, old photographs from Galicia. And I'm going to talk about them. So you just see, that's really just the background. They are from Galicia, some of them from the First World War, some of them earlier, but it's around 1900, 1914, let's say. So it just shows maybe also the perspective, also the view of the Austrians, how they saw Galicia, what struck them as interesting to be photographed. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the myth of Galicia. The title, of course, is misleading, because we should rather talk about different myths. There's not one myth of Galicia. There's a Polish myth of Galicia. There's a Ukrainian myth, an Austrian myth. I'm going to talk more about the Austrian myth, of course, and a Jewish myth, to mention only a few. And in each case, Galicia has a different meaning. It has another connotation, let's say almost another smell. It evokes different feelings, different memories, good as well as bad. For Poles, Galicia conveys another meaning than for Ukrainians, for Austrian, again, another meaning as for Jews. So Galicia, as we all know, was a multi-ethnic and multicultural country with many nations and ethnic groups existing side by side. And this already constitutes an important ingredient of the myth of Galicia, of the Galician myth. So I'm going to quote here an Austrian historian, Emil Brix, who is a politician and also a historian. He says, Galicia's complicated ethno-political situation with all its national, social and economic conflicts forced the political system of the time and its inhabitants to deal with the question of plurality on a theoretical and on a practical level. With Habsburg, Austria's decision to enact a constitution based on the rule of law, Galicia became a dedicated space of Polish, Ukrainian, and German Jewish cultural blossoming. So until today, this is the myth we still have in our head, and this is the picture of Galicia we still have in our head. Until today, Galicia is often praised as a model of civilization which allowed different ethnic groups and people of different religions to live more or less peacefully together. Of course, this peaceful, we can discuss if it really was peaceful, but let's put that aside. This more or less peaceful coexistence ended in the First World War and the following conflicts. Everybody knows about the Polish-Ukrainian War, 1918-1919. So therefore, Galicia can be seen as something of a failed experiment, to use a term coined by the Polish historian of literature, Stefan Kaczynski. So sometimes Galicia, to mention another myth, is perceived as an Arcadia being called Galicia Felix, epitome of the good old times, but at the same time, it is remembered in another context as the poorhouse of the Habsburg monarchy, a land of eternal poverty and misery, of unspeakably dirty villages and uncivilized people, in some as Halbasien, half Asia, as the Austrian Jewish writer Karl Emil Franzos called his native country with biting sarcasm, half Asia. Franzos was born in a small town of Chotkov in eastern Galicia, but he was raised, strangely enough, in the spirit of German nationalism. In those days, that was quite possible, a Jew being raised as a German nationalist. The myth of Galicia as Arcadia had been gaining popularity in Poland in the last decades, and since the breakup of the Soviet Union, also in the western parts of Ukraine, which once made up eastern Galicia. So historians also speak about the myth of Galicia as Piedmont, a myth shared by Poles and Ukrainians alike, because Galicia was to become the cradle of Polish and also Ukrainian independence, as they both enjoyed in the Austrian province more privileges and rights than Poles in the Prussian province Wielkopolska, or Poles and Ukrainians in Tsarist Russia. This, of course, explains, or is one of the explanations, why Galicia today evokes nostalgic feelings in Poland, as well as in the western part of Ukraine, especially in Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, Stanisławiv, while the darker sides of the former Crown land are often blocked out. In Poland, one could find this positive, very often nostalgic, picture of Galicia already in communist times, although this was not in accordance with the official interpretation, of course. The history of the region assured the Polish elites, that they had always belonged to the West, to Europe, and not to the East, not to the Russian side, which they despised. This is why in the 1970s and 1980s, Galicia became the Polish contribution to the discovery of the phenomenon of Central Europe and the fashion of displaying portraits of Franz Joseph I at the time was Krakow's particular way of opposing Sovietization, writes the Polish historian Jacek Purchla in the introduction to the catalogue, which has been mentioned here already. This was this exhibition being shown in Krakow from October 2014 until March 2015, and after that in Vienna. There are actually two slightly different versions of this exhibition and also of the catalogue. Today one can find portraits of the good emperor and his beautiful wife Sisi, also in Lviv and in other Ukrainian towns. And in both countries, Galicia and names connected with its history have become something like brand names, being used widely in marketing. You can today in Poland buy mineral water with a portrait of Kaiser Franz Josef on it, and all different things, usually for many products. It's Galicia, Franz Josef, or something connected with the history of Galicia. So Galicia apparently sells well. The same, of course, cannot be said about Wielkopolska or about Congress Poland, the Prussian part of divided Poland, or the Russian part of divided Poland. It's inconceivable to imagine, to go to a cafe, for instance, in Poznan, and to find a portrait of the German Kaiser there. You won't find it. And the same, of course, is true for Warsaw. You won't find a portrait or bust of the Russian Tsar, no way. So Galicia is really a special case. It not only evokes bittersweet, nostalgic feelings, which of course often have little to do with the historical reality, but it also became a fascinating topic for literature, art, and film. I just mentioned a couple of names here, which probably you all know them. So the Austrian writers Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, you know, the origin of the Masochism, Sacher-Masoch, who is from Lviv. Josef Roth, he has been translated, I believe, into English. Manes Sperber, I'm not sure if he has been translated, or Martin Buber, you know, the Jewish thinker, with his famous stories of Rabbi Nahman and the Legion of the Baal Shem. Then the Polish writers, and again, only a few names, Bruno Schulz, von Drohobych, Andrzej Stojowski, Julian Stryjkowski, Polish Jewish writer, or Andrzej Kuźniewicz, to name just a few prominent authors of the 20th century. Or the young Ukrainian writers, Yuriy and Drohobych. I met Yuriy only a few days ago, actually in Warsaw. Taras Prochaszko or Halina Petrosaniak, they're all from Stanisławiv. And they form what's known as the Stanisławiv phenomenon, a group of writers and artists from the city now being called, of course, Ivano-Frankivsk. But how can we explain this fashion for a territory which ceased to exist 100 years ago? Why doesn't the myth of Galicia seem to lose its fascination? Before we try to answer this question, we should take a closer look at Galicia itself. And forgive me, of course, you know, I'm talking here to somebody who knows everything much better than me. So, but I mean, okay, we're talking about Galicia. So, the province of Galicia, or to use the official title, the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, as a territory acquired by the Austrians in the first partition of Poland, was named by Viennese bureaucrats, existed as a crown land of the Habsburg monarchy only for about 150 years, from 1772 to 1918. Though the name suggests a long history, Galicia is not really rooted in the past. The name was taken, of course, from the medieval Principality of Halych, but otherwise Austrian Galicia was a political creation of the late 18th century. It became the largest crown land of the Habsburg Empire, and at the same time it was the most populous. When the Austrians took over the territory from the Kingdom of Poland, it had approximately 2.6 million inhabitants, 200,000 of them Jews. And Galicia was, of course, ethnically divided. In the west, the Polish majority, while in the east, Ukrainian majority. The Ukrainians then were called in Austria not Ukrainians, but Ruthenians. And of course, many smaller nations, Germans, Armenians, Slovaks, and so on. In 1914, Galicia had a population of about 8.2 million, 46% of them Roman Catholic, mostly Polish, of course, 42% Greek Catholics, mostly Ukrainians, and 11% Jewish faith. Galicia was, of course, predominantly, it was a rural area with not much industry. And the industry there was mainly connected somehow with agriculture or dependent on agriculture. It was breweries, distilleries, sawmills, and so on. In the huge province, there were only two big cities. In the west, that was Krakow, of course, the medieval Polish capital. And in the west, in the east, it was Lviv, Lemberg, or Lwów. The country had some natural resources, not many. There was salt, the main, sort of the famous salt mine in Wieliczka, which is still existing, and there's something of a museum there. And of course oil, which made Austro-Hungary for a short time before the First World War the third largest oil-producing country in the world after the United States and Russia. The most important oil fields were in the region of Drohobych and Boryslav, and the oil industry became a symbol for the process of modernization. But at the same time, the terrible conditions in the oil fields, especially in the early stage of its development of the oil industry, the exploitation of the workers, mostly day laborers, many of them Ukrainian, in the beginning also many of them Jewish, interestingly enough, aroused the interest of radical socialists and Polish and Ukrainian writers. So on the one hand, the oil boom sparked hopes for the rapid development of the region, which was therefore called proudly Galician Pennsylvania, or Galician California, or El Dorado. But on the other hand, the conditions in which the mostly unskilled workers had to spend their waking and sleeping hours were so harsh, unhealthy, and often dangerous that the same region was also called Galician Hell. So the Ukrainian writer Ivan Franko, of course a revolutionary spirit, born in this region near Drohobych, he presents in his Borislav cycle a dark, very dark picture of this Galician hell. Though some scholars point out that his descriptions may have been realistic, but they were not real. That's what Jaroslav Hrycak writes about Franko, and he should know, because he wrote this beautiful biography of his. The best-known stories from the cycle, of course, are Boa Constrictor and Borislav Smica. Borislav is laughing. Polish writers also dealt with the topic, and there's one book I'm going to mention here, W piekle galicyjskim, in Galician Hell, was in its time very widely read by the Polish author Józef Rogosz, 1844 to 1896, published in 1896, in the year when he died. Rogosz criticizes the conditions, the working conditions, but he also criticizes very much the Jewish oil magnates, as he calls them. And of course, Rogosz is writing in a spirit of, you could almost say, rabid Polish nationalism, depicting Jews and Ukrainians as the main adversaries. Galicia was blessed with fertile land, even black earth, but at the same time it was not really able during the whole existence to feed its inhabitants. There was overpopulation combined with backward agricultural techniques, small land holdings, mostly smaller than 5 hectares. They led to endemic catastrophes, famine, hunger catastrophes, which year after year supposedly caused many thousand deaths among the rural population. That's at least what contemporary writers claim. Now, modern history is not so sure about this. And this, again, makes a part of the Galician myth. One of these writers who claims that Galicia really is to be associated with misery is, of course, the Polish industrialist Stanisław Szczepanowski, with his famous work Nędza Galicji w cyfrach, program energicznego rozwoju gospodarstwa krajowego, Galicia's poverty in numbers, a program for the energetic development of the national economy, published 1888 in Lviv, which played a very important role in fueling this conception or this myth. Modern economists point out that the reality was not as dark as might be believed when we read Szczepanowski's or other books. But Szczepanowski was not the only one to point out that Galicia was really the poorhouse, and Galicia was synonymous with misery. It's also Ivan Franko. When you read Ivan Franko, I want to mention here that Ivan Franko was also a brilliant publicist in German. His German is absolutely brilliant, and you still read it with great pleasure. He was contributing a lot of articles to Viennese and also German magazines and newspapers, and he was really a brilliant writer, also in German. he also wrote, of course, in Polish, so he was really three-lingual. And in one of his articles, he mentions the years of hunger in Galicia, 1847, 1849, 1855, 1865, 76, and 89. And of course, the small peasants were the ones hit hardest by such disasters, while the large, mostly Polish landowners did not very much to improve the situation. As the Canadian historian Paul Robert Magochi, who is here with us, and I'm really very honored, writes, the reluctance of the large landowners in eastern Galicia to change the economic status quo, which assured them an unlimited supply of cheap labor, and the general Austrian policy that considered Galicia to be an agricultural zone, a marketplace, a kind of internal colony for products from the industrially advanced western provinces, Bohemia, Silesia, Lower Austria, are factors that caused the province to remain an economically underdeveloped territory. The sale, of course, of cheap products, and for this is very important the development of the railroads, because without the railroad you couldn't bring these cheap products from these areas, from Lower Austria, Bohemia, to Galicia. So the development of railroads was very important for that. So the sale of cheap products, shoes, clothes, furniture, whatever, from highly industrialized provinces was ruining the home industry and the small craftsmen in Galicia who were pushed out of business. All this led to Galicia being called the poorhouse of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, or in Polish, Galicia I Głodomeria. So a play on words, the official name Galicia and Lodomeria, of course, are the Polish word goły for naked and głodny for hungry. So it's the land of the naked and the hungry. But it was not only the economic conditions that gave Galicia a bad reputation. The province was known throughout the monarchy for its deeply rooted corruption, which was proverbial. Galician elections was a synonym for rigged elections, which explains why the country was often also called Skandalicja in Polish. Another serious problem, just to mention one more, was of course the alcohol. The second reason for the pauperization of the rural population was alcoholism, prevailing mainly in eastern Galicia and in Bukovina, states the Austrian sociologist and historian of emigration Leopold in a profound study on emigration from Austria. Every tiny village in Galicia had at least one inn, in many cases 3 or 4, and they all prospered. Of course, we know why this was. It was not because they were all drunkards, but it was really the economic conditions. They were almost forced to drink because part of the pay from the big landowners, they were given in alcohol, which was produced, alcohol was produced by the landowner, and the peasants were paid partly for a long time in alcohol. And this Galician drinking habit and this Galician alcohol also made its way into Austrian literature. When you read, for instance, Joseph Roth, he is mentioning very often in his beautiful books about Galicia the 90 proof, which is really, so many Austrian officers, drink themselves to death with this 90 proof. For all these reasons, of course, Galicia remained the most underdeveloped and poorest Austrian province until the end of the monarchy in 1918. So in 1859, just to mention a few numbers here, only 20% of the children who should have attended school actually went to school because their labor was needed at home. They were needed as farmhands or whatever, on small farms, in home industry or primitive factories. And many children did not even have the necessary clothes nor shoes to go to school in winter. When I was writing this book on emigration from Galicia, the Emperor of America, I found a very interesting fact that Jews were going through the villages in the Carpathian Mountains in autumn, or let's begin with spring. In spring, they would go through the villages and buying the kožuchs, these sheepskin coats, from the small farmers. And they would mend them. They would take them home. They would mend them. And in autumn, they would go through the same villages and sell the kožuchs again, you know. And in many families, there was only one kožuch, one sheepskin coat. So, of course, in summer or in spring, they didn't need it, so they sold it to the Jew, and in fall, they had to buy it back from the Jew, you know, so at least one person could leave the house. So most Austrians saw Galicia as an exotic, a foreign, and a distant, and I'd say also almost a hostile province, which in their eyes did not really belong to their world or their civilization. It was always kept in the mind, sort of this, what Karl Emil Franzus called it, half Asia, halb Asien. And this is still sort of going through the heads of many Austrians. When Austria annexed Galicia, Viennese bureaucrats regarded it their duty to raise this backward province with the help of Enlightenment and Western culture to the level of Western Europe, of Austria. One of the most important tools of this mission was to become the German language. And there's a very early Austrian writer, quite interesting, a lawyer, Franz Kratter, who had gone to Galicia in very early years, and he wrote very famous letters about the present condition of Galicia, published in 1786. And there he writes, "If then the German language is spread fully across the land, and through this the people are more familiar with our way of life and our morals, and are Germanized, so it will occur quite naturally that the next generation must already be less raw, less prone to alcoholism and idleness, less bigoted, less a slave, therefore more industrious, entrepreneurial, cleverer, cleaner, and more sociable." So this view of Galicia as a poor country, as a cultural desert, as a home of uncivilized and immature people, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews alike, prejudiced many Austrians until the end. For most civil servants or officers, to be sent to Galicia was equivalent to being banished, being sent to a penal colony. And here another quote from Joseph Roth from his novel The Radetzky Marsh. "Any strangers who came to this part of the world were slowly but irresistibly doomed. No one was a match for the swamp." Especially the Austrian officers in the garrisons along the border with Russia were prone to be sucked up and destroyed by this dangerous, strange world. Once again, this quote, "And in the tedious, swampy remoteness of the garrison, from time to time, an officer would fall prey to despair, cards, debts, and sinister contacts. The cemeteries of the border garrisons held the bodies of many weak young men." So the swamp, which Joseph Roth paints here, is of course a metaphor for the Galician way of life as being seen from the perspective of Vienna, a metaphor for laziness, idleness, for roads and villages drowning in mud, but also for the endemic corruption. The experience of the First World War confirmed this negative stereotype. This I know actually from my own experience, because my stepfather, Hans Pollack, I carry his name, he had been serving in Galicia in the First World War. And he not very often spoke about Galicia. He didn't want to speak about his experience. He was there as a young officer. But in his sporadic tales of the war, he painted a dismal picture of that faraway foreign land. He remembered wide wooded uplands and impoverished hamlets where everything was built from wood, even the churches. I remember that this was for him the most surprising thing, you know, that the people were so poor. He thought they were so poor that they built the churches from wood, because this in Austria is not to be imagined, you know. I mean, everybody, no wooden churches in Austria, of course. And of course, he also remembered the war, you know, villages lying in ashes, ruins of small homesteads with nothing but the chimneys still standing. And you remember, you've probably seen these photographs from the First World War, also the Second World War, from these areas, Ukraine, Belarus also, where just the chimneys keep standing, you know, because they were the only structure made of bricks, so they didn't burn. The inhabitants, again, my stepfather from, were complete and utter strangers in coarse linen tunics and greasy sheepskins, against whom you always had to be on guard because they were all under suspicion of spying for the Russians. And finally, Galicia to him meant countless Jews in the villages and small towns, dressed from a bygone era and speaking a strange jargon, faintly reminiscent of German. My stepfather called them Shtetl or Kaftan Jews, or simply Galician Jews, and he made no pretense of the fact that he felt nothing for them but repulsion and contempt. Merely the mentioning of Galicia aroused anti-Semitic reactions in many Austrians. And I don't know if any of you read Hitler's Mein Kampf, you know, this famous work which now had been published again, annotated edition in Germany. And in the beginning, when Hitler went to Vienna as a young man to become what he thought he would become a painter, well, we all know that he was a very miserable painter. So he met for the first time Galician Jews. That was even before the First World War, because there were quite a lot of them emigrating to Austria, to Vienna. Most of them stayed in Vienna. And this picture of these strangely dressed people with side locks and with strange hats and kaftans, he writes about this in Mein Kampf, that this made him an anti-Semite, which of course was not true, because at the time when he was in Vienna, he actually had quite good contacts with Jews. It was mostly Jews, mainly Jews who were buying his pictures. And as I said, his pictures are really miserable. So, I mean, he should be thankful, you know, that he found anybody who bought them. So even today, for many observers in the West, anything connected with Galicia is first and foremost Jewish, especially Galician literature and culture. But the perception of this has radically changed. While up until the Second World War, Jewish Galicia, the Shtetl, with its exotically dressed inhabitants, with the side locks, the fur hats, and the kaftans, evoked almost only negative feelings, rejection, often revulsion, and was associated with backwardness, dirt, obscurantism, corruption, etc. Now, 2 or 3 generations later, that same world arouses lively interest and deep sympathies. All of a sudden, the Jewish Shtetl, the Jewish districts of bigger cities, for instance, Kazimierz in Kraków, I don't know if anybody of you has been there, it's a bit of a Hollywood version of a Shtetl, really, so Disneyland, are seen as a wondrous mixture of sentimental Anatevka folklore, the schmaltzy strain of klezmer, and the Jewish wit and wisdom. Jewish Galicia has completely lost its negative image. And this is not only true for Jewish Galicia, but it's true for Galicia on the whole. Because the perception of Galicia, while it existed as a crown land, was mostly negative. Galicia meant being far, being strange, being dirty, whatever. All negative stereotypes. While after it ceased to exist, it took a few years, but now we have an entirely different picture, of course, of Galicia. Now it's mostly positive. Now it's nostalgic. But how are we to explain the fact that today many people all but yearn for the world so brutally destroyed and murdered by their fathers and grandfathers. And here I know what I'm talking about. It has been mentioned, my father was SS, Gestapo, and he was in one of the Sonderkommandos. He was actually not in Galicia, but he was in Poland, what I found out only when I wrote the book on my family, and later in Slovakia. So the world, our parents or our grandparents killed this world, they burned this world, they destroyed this world, while now my generation, later generation, they think this is a most interesting world, fantastic world. So this perception really has changed radically. But still, there is the fact that Galicia in the West is mainly associated with Jewish. Galicia means almost a synonym for Jewish. In Austria, in Germany, also in the United States, Galician, Galiciana, that's Jews. While Polish literature and culture are in the German-speaking countries, and also, of course, in many other countries, much less known, less popular than Jewish literature, not to talk about Ukrainian literature. Ukrainian literature is in Western Europe still a great unknown, a terra incognita, even the classics of the previous century. We recently had to acknowledge this in 2014, when the anniversary of the First World War. There were many books published on the First World War. There were many anthologies published. And I found it quite interesting. In German, there was a very thick anthology of authors writing, contemporary authors writing on the First World War. There were Polish, English, American, French, Italian, German, of course, Russian, Czech, Hungarian, everything. But not a single Ukrainian writer. Not a single Ukrainian writer. Although, of course, the front of Galicia was quite an important front, and there, of course, there also I don't have to tell you that, of course, you could find something in Ukrainian literature on the First World War, but not a single writer has been found, can be found in these anthologies, which isn't really surprising, because we don't have many translations. For instance, just Osip Turiansky's poetic novel Beyond the Limits of Pain, which had actually been published for the first time in Vienna, in Austria. I think in 1921, if I'm not mistaken, in a Ukrainian publishing house. Or other Ukrainian writers, I'm not going to mention them here because you know them much better than me. So we call this First World War on the Eastern Front very often the forgotten war in comparison with the First World War on the Western Front. Verdun, Battle of the Somme, this is very well remembered. While the Eastern Front, Galicia, Belarus, is really mostly forgotten. The First World War intensified these stereotypes, these negative stereotypes of many Austrians and also Germans against Galicia, which many of them now saw for the first time with their own eyes. And so, of course, you can see the war as not only the First World War, but the same is true for the Second World War, also as a huge tourist venture, because many soldiers, for the first time in their life, went abroad, and many soldiers went to far lands which they never even heard before. So like Galicia, Of course, they didn't really wish to go to Galicia. They wouldn't have gone on their own, by their own will. But they were sent there, like my stepfather. And what they experienced, of course, was Galician hell. So Galicia was to become a metaphor for hunger, lice-ridden trenches, for large-scale slaughter, and wretched death. You find this in Austrian literature as well as in many other literatures. One of the best poets, Austrian poets, Trakel, He was actually serving in Galicia and he died there. It's not sure if he committed suicide or not. And he wrote about the war on the Eastern Front in Galicia. It's like very moving poems. So in the first year of the war, the Austrian army suffered huge losses. It turned out to be no match for the grossly underestimated Russian army, which was fearfully so called the Russian steamroller, because it pushed back the Austrians with such force and such speed. So the success of the Russians on the Galician front came as a bitter surprise to the Austrian public, and this again intensified the negative feelings towards this remote area and its people, especially the Ruthenians, the Ukrainians, who were collectively suspected of being traitors and spies for the enemy. This led to mass-scale deportation of Ukrainians from their villages and towns. Tens of thousands were interned in concentration camps in Austria. One of the most ill-famed such camp was near Graz, Thalerhof, where there's now, what do you call it, Flughafen, oh God. Airport. What? Airport, oh Jesus Christ, yes. Yeah, there's now the local airport. And it's quite funny, you know, because at that local airport, this was really built on the site of the camp. And they had also dug up a Roman villa, which, of course, from time of the Romans. When you go to this airport, it's a small airport, you find everything on this Roman villa, you know, pictures and bricks and God knows what, but no single mentioning of the camp, you know, where many Ukrainians perished. Many Ukrainians perished. So until quite recently, this fact, you know, that the Austrian army really was fighting against its own people and was deporting them, executing them, was denied in Austria. Not denied, it was just not seen. Although you can find it in Austrian literature. You know, it's not difficult to find descriptions of this. For instance, this one novel I've been mentioning already, you know, the Radetzky Marsh, which by many is seen as a sort of a nostalgic picture of Galicia, a bitter nostalgic picture of Galicia. There you find exactly this fact. And I'm quoting here once again Joseph Roth. The High Command issued contradictory orders. Most of these were to do with the evacuation of towns and villages and the treatment of pro-Russian Ukrainians. Orthodox priests and spies hastily formed courts-martial, handed down hasty judgments. Secret informants supplied unverifiable reports on peasants, priests, teachers, photographers, civil servants. There was no time. They were in a hurry to retreat, but also in a hurry to punish the traitors. And while ambulances, baggage columns, field guns, dragoons, uhlans, and infantrymen met up in various configurations under the incessant rain on the softened roads and the little church squares of the villages and hamlets, the shots of hastily assembled firing squads executed the hasty death sentences, and ominous drums rolls accompanied the monotonous judgments of the courts-martial, and the wives of the slain lay screaming for mercy in front of the muddy boots of the officers, and flickering red and silver flames shot out of huts and barns, sheds and outbuildings. The Austrian army's war began with punishment, with courts-martial. For many days, the real or supposed traitors were left dangling on trees in the church squares as an example for the living. And also, quite recently, a few weeks ago, there were memoirs of a Austrian private soldier during the First World War published. And he also describes this in detail. He describes these scenes in gruesome, really brutal details. And he feels for them. And there's one scene really where the Austrian army is ordering a whole village of Ukrainians to leave the village immediately because the Russians are coming. I think they get something like 6 hours. So of course they're all confused, these small peasants. They don't know what to take, what to leave behind, you know. They're all confused. And if they come back, they said they'll be treated as spies. And he describes how 3 girls, they turned back to the village because they forgot to take some money, a small sum of money they'd hidden somewhere in the house. And they forgot in the confusion to take it. So they come back, they're caught by the Austrians, they're brought before the officer, and he says, hang them. And there's no reason. And of course, nobody doubts their story. They're not spies, but they're hanged nevertheless. So these scenes you find very often in literature. And until now, this was not really recognized. You know, the Austrians read the Radetzky March, and everybody said, that's a beautiful picture of Galicia. But for some reason or the other, you know, they apparently didn't read these chapters, you know, on these executions. So the belief that many Ukrainians were helping the Russian enemy indicates, of course, how little most Austrians and also Germans knew about their own people. For many, the mere fact, and I also remember that my stepfather also said, that they were using the Cyrillic alphabet was, of course, meant, you know, that it was a firm proof that they were in collusion with the Russians. Another quite popular writer for his time was a German writer, Ludwig Ganghofer. Very famous, very prolific writer, and he accompanied German troops in Galicia during the First World War. So today we would call him an embedded journalist. You know, he's really going with the troops. He writes in a report from the front, which was published already in 1915 in book form, what he had seen there. And he writes about these Russian icons hanging in front of every door of these small Ruthenian huts, as he describes them. And he interprets this as a striking evidence that they're all pro-Russian, that all, you know, spies for the Russian. Just this icon. And an icon apparently was enough for a poor peasant to get hanged. So all these atrocities, the fighting, the dying, the deportations, the courts-martial, the execution of innocent people, they add up to the dark side of the Galician myth. And in this case, of course, it's Galicia as a Ukrainian myth. And when you go today to Carpathian Mountains, even in Poland, you know, the former Ukrainian territories, my publisher actually lives there. Polish publisher lives in one of these former Ukrainian villages. And in some of the villages, you still find monuments to the victims of Talehov. And the people there, they know the name of Talehov. You know, the Ukrainians know the name of Talehov, though very often they don't know where Talehov lies, where it is situated. But the name Talehov rings a bell, because that's where their grandparents, their great-grandparents perished. So I've pointed out that the war also was something of a tourist venture, you know, tourism venture, you know, bringing soldiers to far places for the first time in their life. And this you can also see in photography. Many of the pictures here were taken during the First World War. They were taken by either professional photographers, you know, many serving in uniform and going with the troops, or also by private soldiers. Because then, even in the First World War, quite a lot of them had already cameras with them. So it was quite natural for them to take photographs of unknown regions, of towns and villages, of people dressed in strange traditional costumes, and they were labeled Volkstypen, you know, sort of type of a ethnic group, and they made very interesting motifs. And of course, these photographs also were to show the superiority of the Austrians and the Germans. They were to show how poor these people were, how dirty it was. And it's quite interesting that you find the same phenomenon in the Second World War. When you look at photographs from the Second World War, which of course there are millions of them, millions. And you look at them, Russian motifs, Belarus, Ukraine, it's very often exactly the same. It shows poor dwellings, shows poor people in rags to show that they are inferior people. They're almost subhuman. So photography plays a very important role in this. The Ukrainian myth of Galicia, of course, also has its positive side. I've pointed out already that many Ukrainians in the late 19th century placed their hope on Galicia to become their Piedmont and to carry the mission of national cultural revival, which was denied to them, of course, in Tsarist Russia. So publishing houses, newspapers, Ukrainian language, whatever was allowed in Austria. So Galicia really, they put their hope into it. This was made possible by the rapid growth of Ukrainian nationalism, which was of course confronted by its Polish counterpart. So, and here's a quote from Mikla Hrabchuk: "The relatively liberal policies of the Habsburgs enabled Ruthenians to institutionalize their nation-building project, first through the Uniate Church, which received equal rights with the dominant Catholic Church in Galicia, and then via education, media, cultural institutions, civic organizations, and finally political parties," writes the Ukrainian scholar Mikla Rabchuk. The Ruthenian peasants, who had not cared much about his national identity before, now he became a convinced Ukrainian, well aware of his cultural and historical heritage. Emigration played also an important role in this by speeding up the process of turning illiterate peasants into nationally conscious Ukrainians. And when you look at the emigration, this is quite interesting that really in the 1880s when it began, many people did not even know which nationality they were, if they were asked, mostly they weren't asked. But then it was like in Polish, it's called tutejsi, so from here, okay, I'm from this village and that's it, which of course only a decade later had changed. And even in today's Ukraine, of course, we can discern many traits which distinguish the local Galicians from people from other regions. Galicians are said to have a higher national awareness and a stronger pro-European feelings. And this is one of the factors why the Russian propaganda, now, I'm talking about now, against the Ukrainian democratic movement is really focusing on Galicia, or rather on persons connected with Galicia, like for instance Stepan Bandera, who for Russians seems to be the embodiment of evil. Putin speaks in his propaganda speeches usually not about Ukrainians, that's what Yaroslav Hrycak points out, but about Banderites, alleged fascists, ultra-nationalists, and rabid anti-Semites, thus evoking, of course, the memory of the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945. In Putin's interpretation, these Banderites associated with Galicia try to drag Ukraine away from its true destination, which is to play the role, of course, of the smaller brother, of the big brother, and the smaller brother who is looking up to his big brother with admiration. The fact that the memory of Galicia and its myth have survived for such a long time comes, in my opinion, as a bitter surprise for the Russians. When Galicia disappeared with the collapse of the Habsburg Empire from the maps, it was really meant to sink into oblivion. The former Austrian province was named in Poland, so it became Polish, of course, not Galicia, but it was named Małopolska, thus emphasizing the hegemony of everything Polish, Polish history, Polish culture, Polish language, and wiping out the memory of the local groups and other nations, above all, of course, of Ukrainians. I don't have to go into the details here about the Polish-Ukrainian conflict. The conflict between Poles and Ukrainians in former Galicia, of course, led to harsh repressions against Ukrainians and in the years to come to bloody massacres and ethnic cleansing. But also the Soviet authorities did their best to make the name Galicia, the memory of Galicia, to disappear, because they called these regions not Galicia or whatever, but Western Ukraine. So to make forget the Polish rule and questioning the right of Poland to these territories. But also ignoring the cultural identity of Galicians, to which many intellectuals, artists, and writers referred again at the end of the 20th century. All these efforts failed, as we know. Galicia is still with us. Its myth has apparently not lost its fascination. On the contrary, with a little imagination, Galicia could be seen also as a model of en miniature of Central Europe, a multi-ethnic, multilingual space that experienced the same tragedy as Central Europe. And the myth of Galicia was also fostering the regional identity of the regions of southern Poland and western Ukraine, and the cultural relations between Poles and Ukrainians. This can be shown, I just want to point out, the example of my Polish publisher Czarne, which is actually situated in this region, in the Beskid Niski. And they publish a lot of Ukrainian authors, like Yuriy Andruchowicz, Taras Prochasko. And the interesting thing is that the Polish-Ukrainian conflict, of course it still exists. When you go to Poland, I mean, talk to the average Pole about Ukraine, he says, oh, they're all murderers, you know, they're rezuns, you know, they set fire to everything. But with the Polish intellectuals, it's a entirely different story. I have many Polish friends who publish on Ukraine, who go to the Ukraine. I mean, everybody here knows, of course, the role Poland played in recent events. It was a very positive role. And the interesting thing is that not only, for instance, for me, who is also engaged in this conflict, I can say on the Ukrainian side, you know, most information I get on the Ukraine and what's going on there, I get from the Polish press, because they inform really very well. Gazeta Wyborcza has excellent correspondence there, and they are informing very well and very deeply. While if you read Austrian papers, maybe German papers, maybe a bit better. But on the whole, the knowledge in our countries, and this we saw during this conflict, is still very small. You know, there is still a lack of elementary knowledge. And this is really, there's a lot still to do. And I think we could use the Galician myth to help us in that. You know, when we prepared this exhibition and did things, it was possible, you know, to point out that there are interesting writers. Maybe we should translate them. So I think you can make use of a myth for a positive, you know, and that's definitely true with the Galician myth. And there is a big need, because in the German-speaking world, the Ukraine is totally still, almost totally unknown. And this, I have to admit, as an Austrian writer, as an Austrian translator, this is a shame. Thank you very much.